You are a crippled, broken king, and I am the refuse they tossed at your feet to mock you, Deborah whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze unyielding as she stared into the shadowed eyes of the man in the wheelchair. Stanley laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the cold stone walls. Then we are perfectly matched, Omega. Two discarded things waiting for the wolves to finish us off. I am not waiting to die, Your Majesty, she replied, a strange, ethereal warmth flickering beneath her skin. And neither are you. The fortress of the Silver Crest Pack loomed against the jagged cliffs like the rotting carcass of a once great beast. Rain slashed against the iron-wrought carriage as it rumbled over the cobblestone courtyard, but Deborah Holt did not flinch. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the thin, threadbare fabric of her grey dress offering no warmth against the biting autumn chill. She was an Omega, a reject, a wolf whose spirit had supposedly been broken the night her former alpha, Vernon Peck, had cast her out in front of the entire Blood Moon pack. You are weak, Deborah, useless. You bring no strength to our bloodline. Vernon's voice still echoed in her mind, accompanied by the cruel, high-pitched laughter of his mate, Rhonda Haynes. They had sold her to the Silver Crest as a political joke, a bride for an alpha king who could no longer walk. The carriage doors groaned open. The scent of wet pine and old blood rushed in. Standing in the downpour was Terence Boyle, the beta of the Silver Crest, and by his side stood his mate, Diane Pratt. Diane was draped in luxurious black furs, her piercing green eyes raking over Deborah with undisguised disgust. So, this is the grand bride, Terence sneered, his voice smooth like oiled steel. He was a tall, imposing man who carried himself as though he already wore the crown. Vernon Peck has a wicked sense of humor, sending us the runt of his litter. She's shivering, Diane mocked, stepping closer, her expensive perfume masking the scent of the rain. Careful, Omega. The draft in the king's chambers might just kill you before he does. Deborah kept her eyes lowered, not out of submission, but out of necessity. She had learned long ago that survival meant blending into the shadows. I am here to serve the king, she murmured. The king doesn't need a servant. He needs a miracle, and you are far from it, Terence scoffed. He gestured sharply to a burly guard. Wallace, take her to him. Wallace York, the pack's Gamma, stepped forward. Unlike Terence, his expression was entirely unreadable. He did not shove her or snarl. He simply nodded toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. Follow me, Mum. The interior of the fortress was a mausoleum of lost glory. Tapestries depicting great hunts hung in tatters. The air was thick with the scent of sickness and despair. Wallace led her up 3 flights of spiraling stone stairs until they reached a heavy iron door guarded by his mate, Tammy Rowe. Tammy gave Deborah a sympathetic, albeit fleeting glance before pushing the door open. The chamber was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers of a hearth. The stench of medicinal herbs and festering wounds was overpowering. In the center of the gloom, silhouetted against a rain-streaked window, sat Alpha King Stanley Fry. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders hunched, his powerful legs uselessly covered by a heavy wool blanket. The right side of his face was marred by 3 jagged scars, the remnants of the ambush that had severed his spine and silenced his wolf. Get out! Stanley's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in Deborah's chest. It was the growl of a cornered, wounded predator. Your Majesty, Deborah said softly, stepping fully into the room as the heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. Stanley spun his wheelchair around with startling ferocity. His eyes, once a vibrant, terrifying gold, were now a dull, cloudy amber. Did Terence send you to gloat? To see how the mighty have fallen? Look closely, Omega. Drink it in. I was sent here to be your wife, Deborah said, her voice steady. A wife, Stanley roared, slamming his massive fist against the armrest of his chair. The wood splintered under his strength. I am a king without a wolf. I cannot walk, I cannot lead the hunt, and I certainly cannot mate. You are a mockery wrapped in a wedding gown, sent by enemies who wish to see me humiliated before they slit my throat. He expected her to cry. He expected her to cower, to beg at the door to be let out. Instead, Deborah walked toward the hearth. She knelt, her small hands picking up the iron poker, and began to stoke the dying embers. I know what it is to be humiliated, Alpha, Deborah said quietly as the fire flared to life, casting dancing golden light across her pale face. I know what it is to be deemed useless and left to rot. You can yell at me, you can break the furniture, but I am not leaving, because unlike the rest of your pack, I do not look at you and see a corpse. I see a man who is in pain. Stanley stared at her, the hostility in his chest faltering for a fraction of a second. No one had spoken to him without pity or thinly veiled contempt in 6 months. The small, fragile Omega stoked the fire, and for the first time since the ambush, Stanley felt the biting chill in his chamber begin to retreat. The first week was a grueling test of endurance. Deborah quickly learned the political landscape of the Silver Crest Pack was as toxic as the poison lingering in Stanley's veins. Terence Boyle was the puppet master, slowly bleeding Stanley's authority dry, while masquerading as his loyal beta. Diane Pratt, who had once been betrothed to Stanley before his injury, paraded around the fortress, reminding everyone that a crippled king and an Omega Queen were an insult to the moon goddess. Deborah's days were spent in isolation. She was barred from the pack's communal dining hall and relegated to taking her meals in Stanley's dark chambers. But Deborah was observant. She noticed the subtle things. She noticed that the medicine prescribed by the pack healers made Stanley sweat profusely and sleep for days. She noticed that Wallace and Tammy stood guard outside their door, not just to keep her in, but to keep assassins out. One evening, while Stanley was trapped in a feverish, drug-induced sleep, Deborah slipped out of the chambers. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors until she reached the lowest level of the fortress, the domain of the pack elders, Ulysses Cobb and Sherry Atkinson. The two elders were ancient, their fur graying and their eyes milky with age, but their minds were sharp as obsidian. Deborah found them poring over ancient, crumbling tomes in a dust-choked library. "You shouldn't be down here, child," Ulysses rasped, without looking up from his book. "Terence's guards will whip you if they find an Omega wandering the halls." "I don't care about Terence," Deborah said, stepping into the candlelight. "I care about the king, the medicine you give him. It isn't healing him, it's keeping his wolf suppressed." Sherry Atkinson looked up, her wrinkled face softening. "You have a sharp eye, little one, but you misunderstand. We are not suppressing his wolf out of malice. We are doing it to keep him alive." Deborah frowned, stepping closer to the massive oak table. "Explain." Ulysses closed his tome with a heavy thud. "Stanley was not just attacked by rogues, Deborah. He was struck with a blade coated in Shadowsbane, a dark ancient poison meant to sever the tether between a shifter and their inner wolf. If his wolf were to awaken now, while his body is paralyzed and broken, the beast would tear him apart from the inside in its frenzy to escape the crippled vessel. We keep him sedated to save his life. But it's killing his spirit," Deborah whispered, the realization sinking in. "Terence knows this. He's waiting for Stanley to wither away, so he can challenge him legally and take the throne without a rebellion." "Exactly," Sherry sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. "And there is no cure for Shadowsbane, only time, and a miracle we do not possess." Deborah left the library with a heavy heart, her mind racing. As she walked back to the king's chambers, she felt that strange, familiar warmth pooling in the center of her chest. It was a sensation she had hidden her entire life. Omegas were supposed to be submissive, weak, and powerless. But ever since she was a child, Deborah could feel the life force of living things. She had once healed a dying bird just by holding it, a secret that had terrified her so much she had locked the power away deep inside her soul. When she re-entered the chamber, Stanley was thrashing in his bed, caught in the throes of a violent nightmare. Sweat beaded on his scarred forehead, and low, agonizing groans tore from his throat. His massive hands gripped the sheets, tearing the fabric. "Stanley," Deborah whispered, rushing to his side. She reached out, intending to wipe the sweat from his brow, but the moment her fingers grazed his burning skin, a shockwave of energy rippled through the room. Stanley's eyes snapped open. They weren't amber. For a fleeting second, they were a blinding, brilliant gold. Deborah gasped, trying to pull her hand back, but Stanley's grip shot out, wrapping around her wrist like an iron vice. He was breathing heavily, staring at her as if she were a ghost. Your hand," Stanley choked out, his voice raw. "It's cold. It stopped the burning." Deborah looked down. Beneath her palm, a faint, silvery light was pulsing, sinking past Stanley's skin and into his poisoned veins. The agony in his face had melted away, replaced by profound, breathless shock. "What are you?" Stanley whispered, releasing her wrist slowly. Deborah pulled her hand back, trembling as the light faded. I don't know," she lied, terrified he would brand her a witch and have her executed. "I'm just an Omega." Stanley didn't yell. He didn't order her away. Instead, he reached out, his large, calloused hand gently hovering over hers. "Do it again," he commanded, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a desperate, quiet plea. "Please, Deborah, just make the fire stop." For the next month, the king's chambers became a sanctuary of secrets. Every night, while the fortress slept and the rain lashed against the high windows, Deborah would sit by Stanley's side. She would place her hands over his paralyzed legs and let the silver, ethereal light flow from her spirit into his body. It was grueling, exhausting work. The Shadow's Bane was like a thick, sentient black tar wrapped around Stanley's spine, and Deborah had to chip away at it piece by tedious piece. Some nights, the poison fought back, sending agonizing spikes of cold up Deborah's arms, leaving her gasping and shivering on the stone floor. She sacrificed her own vitality, her cheeks growing hollower and her skin paler, even as a miraculous change occurred in the king. The dark circles under Stanley's eyes vanished, his broad chest filled out with muscle again. The pallor of impending death was replaced by a healthy, fierce flush. Though he still could not walk, the bitter, broken man was slowly being replaced by the sharp, calculating Alpha King. And between them, an undeniable bond began to form. It was built in the quiet, vulnerable hours of the night, in the shared silence of two outcasts who had found an unexpected anchor in one another. "You're quiet tonight," Stanley noted one evening, watching Deborah as she worked. He was sitting propped up against the headboard, his eyes fixed on her face. He found himself cataloguing her features more and more lately, the soft curve of her jaw, the fierce determination in her dark brown eyes, the way her hair fell like spilled ink over her delicate shoulders. "I'm focusing," Deborah murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silver light pulsed brightly between her palms, illuminating the deep scars on his legs. "You're thinking about your old pack," Stanley deduced, his tone darkening to a protective rumble. "About Vernon Peck." Deborah's hands faltered. The light flickered and died. She pulled back, wrapping her arms around her own waist, suddenly feeling very small. "Tomorrow is the Blood Moon Summit. Vernon will be here. He'll expect to see me crawling on the floor, begging for scraps. He'll expect to see you dead." "Let him expect it," Stanley growled softly, the sound vibrating in his broad chest. "Expectations are the playground of fools." He reached out, catching her chin with his index finger and gently forcing her to look at him. His touch sent a sudden, thrilling jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You will never crawl for anyone again, Deborah. Do you hear me? You are my wife. You wear the crest of the Silver Pack now. If Vernon Peck looks at you with even a fraction of disrespect, I will tear out his throat." "You can't even stand, Stanley," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek at the sheer intensity in his golden eyes. "If Terence and Vernon ally themselves, they will kill you. I'm trying, but I can't heal you fast enough. Then we will fight them from the floor," Stanley rumbled, his thumb brushing the tear away. His gaze dropped to her lips, the tension between them, thickening, shifting rapidly from political allies to something raw, primitive, and deeply intimate. The air in the room grew heavy, the scent of his pine and amber musk wrapping around her like a physical embrace. Before either of them could bridge the gap, the heavy oak doors of the chamber exploded inward. Splinters rained like shrapnel across the room. A heavy metallic thud followed. Wallace York was thrown violently through the doorway, crashing into the stone wall. He was bleeding from a massive gash on his head. Wallace tried to push himself up, his claws extending with a snarl, but a heavy boot stomped on his back, pinning the Gamma down. Standing in the doorway were 3 rogue wolves in human form, holding bloodied, curved silver daggers. "The Beta sends his regards," the lead rogue sneered, twisting the blade in his hand. Stanley roared, an instinctive, furious sound that rattled the very stones of the fortress. He threw himself forward, but his paralyzed legs anchored him to the bed. He grabbed his heavy bedside sword, swinging wildly, but he was painfully off balance. The rogues lunged. Stanley managed to parry the first strike, the clang of steel echoing sharply, but the second rogue slashed at his arm, drawing a line of bright red blood. Stanley snarled, dropping the sword to grab the rogue by the throat, crushing his windpipe in an instant. But the third assassin vaulted over the bed, dagger raised high, aiming straight for the king's chest. "No!" Deborah screamed. Instinct, unbridled and ancient, took over. Deborah didn't run. She didn't cower. She threw herself between the king and the descending blade. As the lead rogue brought his dagger down, Deborah thrust her hands forward. The air in the chamber suddenly dropped by 20 degrees. Frost crawled rapidly up the stone walls. She didn't just summon a trickle of healing light, she unleashed a shockwave. A blinding, explosive aura of pure, white-silver energy erupted from her small frame. The sheer force of the spiritual blast was deafening. The assassin's silver dagger shattered into fine dust, before it even touched her skin. The shockwave hit the remaining rogues like a physical wall, lifting them off their feet and throwing them violently backward into the corridor, where they crumpled into motionless heaps. The air in the room crackled fiercely with static electricity, smelling of sharp ozone and sweet moonflowers. Stanley shielded his eyes from the blinding radiance. When he looked back, he stared in absolute disbelief. Deborah was standing in the center of the room, panting heavily, her hair floating around her shoulders as if suspended in water. Her eyes, usually a soft brown, were glowing with a terrifying, ethereal silver fire. She wasn't just an Omega. She was a spirit weaver, a myth from the old world, a wolf born once in a millennium with the power to manipulate the raw energy of the moon goddess herself. The immense drain of the blast took its toll. Deborah collapsed to her knees, the glow fading from her eyes, leaving her gasping for air and trembling violently. Stanley didn't hesitate. He threw his upper body off the bed, disregarding the pain, as he dragged himself across the cold stone floor with his massive muscular arms until he reached her. He pulled her flush against his broad chest, wrapping his arms fiercely around her fragile form to shield her from any remaining threats. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely into her hair, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against hers. "I've got you, my beautiful, terrifying queen." The morning of the Blood Moon Summit arrived with a suffocating tension. The great hall of the Silver Crest Fortress was draped in crimson and silver banners. Alpha Vernon Peck and his mate, Rhonda Haynes, strutted into the hall as if they owned it, greeting Terence Boyle with overly familiar embraces. Deborah stood on the dais beside Stanley's wheelchair. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, her posture rigidly straight, a delicate silver crown resting in her hair. She looked nothing like the broken Omega Vernon had sold a month ago, but that didn't stop the cruel Alpha from trying to break her. "Well, well," Vernon drawled, walking up to the dais, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Little Deborah, playing dress-up, are we? You look almost respectable for a runt." Rhonda giggled, sipping from a goblet of wine. "Don't pretend, Vernon. You can put an Omega in silk, but she still smells like dirt. Tell me, Deborah, does His Majesty force you to sleep at the foot of his chair like a good dog?" Stanley gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to unleash a verbal slaughter, but Deborah beat him to it. "It is bold of you to speak of dogs, Alpha Peck," Deborah said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. Every eye turned to her. "Considering you arrived at our gates panting and begging for a trade alliance because your borders are overrun by rogues that you are too weak to fend off." A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Diane Pratt nearly dropped her glass. Terence Boyle's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Vernon's face flushed a violent crimson. "You dare speak to me with that tone, you worthless wretch. I am an Alpha. You are nothing but my discarded trash." He stepped forward, raising a hand to strike her. Before Vernon's hand could fall, Stanley's hand snapped out with the speed of a striking viper, catching Vernon by the wrist. The crunch of bone echoed in the quiet hall. Vernon howled in agony, dropping to his knees. "Touch my queen." Stanley's voice was lethally quiet, vibrating with an Alpha command that forced every wolf in the room to lower their heads, "and I will rip your arm from its socket and beat you to death with it." Stanley shoved Vernon backward. The rival Alpha scrambled away, clutching his shattered wrist. Terence stepped forward, his mask of loyalty finally slipping. "This is madness, Stanley. You assault an allied Alpha over an Omega? You are unstable. The poison has rotted your brain. You are unfit to lead." "And who is fit, Terence?" Stanley growled, his amber eyes burning into his cousin. "You, the man who sent assassins into my bedchamber last night." The hall erupted into chaos. Whispers of treason and murder flew through the crowd. Terence laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Prove it. You have no proof. Look at you, Stanley. You are confined to a chair. You are a shadow. The Silver Crest needs a strong Alpha, not a cripple. I hereby invoke the right of challenge. I challenge you for the crown." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. By ancient wolf law, an Alpha could not refuse a direct challenge for the throne. If he did, he forfeited the crown. But a physical fight to the death was impossible for a paralyzed man. Diane Pratt stepped up beside Terence, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Step down, Stanley. Surrender the crown to Terence, and perhaps he will let you and your pathetic Omega live out your days in the dungeons." Deborah looked down at Stanley, her heart hammered against her ribs. Last night's blast had exhausted her, but she had managed to burn away the final traces of the Shadow's Bane. The poison was gone. All that was left was for Stanley to find his wolf again. "Accept the challenge," Deborah whispered down to him, her eyes fierce. Stanley looked up at her, seeing the unwavering faith in her gaze. He turned back to Terence, a dark, predatory smile spreading across his scarred face. "I accept." The courtyard was cleared. The entire pack, along with Vernon Peck's visiting delegation, formed a massive circle under the pale light of the eclipsed moon. Rain had begun to fall again, slicking the cobblestones. Terence stood in the center, shedding his fine coat, his muscles bulging as his eyes flashed the yellow of a beta preparing to kill. "Bring him out," Terence shouted to the crowd. "Let us finish this farce." The heavy oak doors opened. Wallace York and Tammy Rowe, both bearing heavy bandages from the assassin attack, wheeled Stanley out into the rain. They pushed him to the edge of the circle and stepped back. Deborah stood beside the chair. She placed her hands on Stanley's shoulders. She closed her eyes, tapping into the deepest reserves of her soul. She didn't need to heal him anymore. She needed to awaken the beast. "Wake up," she whispered through the bond they had formed, her spirit reaching into the dark void of Stanley's mind. "Wake up, my king. Are you going to fight me from the chair, cousin?" Terence mocked, pacing the ring like a hungry wolf. "Or shall I just slit your throat here and spare us the embarrassment?" "You talk too much, Terence," Stanley said softly. He placed his hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. The courtyard went deathly silent. Not even the wind dared to howl. Slowly, agonizingly, Stanley pushed himself up. His muscles, dormant for 6 months, trembled violently. The veins in his neck bulged. A low, guttural growl began to build in the depths of his chest. It wasn't the sound of a man. It was the sound of a monstrous, primordial beast clawing its way to the surface. Deborah's hands glowed with a brilliant, blinding silver light, funneling raw energy into his spine. With a resounding crack that echoed like thunder, Stanley's legs locked into place. He stood. He was a foot taller than Terence, an absolute titan of muscle and fury. The blanket fell from his waist. He stepped forward, his boots crushing the wet cobblestones. Terence stumbled backward, his face draining of all color. "No, impossible. The poison, the healers," said. "The healers underestimated my wife," Stanley roared. In a blur of motion, Stanley didn't even bother shifting into his wolf form. He lunged. Terence threw a desperate punch, but Stanley caught his fist, crushing the bones with a sickening crunch. Stanley spun, sweeping Terence's legs out from under him, sending the usurper crashing to the hard stone. Before Terence could shift, Stanley was on top of him. He grabbed Terence by the throat, hoisting the massive beta into the air with one hand, choking the life out of him. "Treason," Stanley snarled, his eyes blazing a pure, dominant alpha gold. "You poisoned my blood. You tried to murder my mate. Give me one reason I shouldn't tear your head off right now." "Mercy!" Diane Pratt screamed, rushing forward, only to be intercepted and thrown to the ground by Tammy Rowe. "Alpha, please," Terence choked out, his legs kicking uselessly in the air. I yield. I yield." Stanley held him there for 5 agonizing seconds, the beast inside him demanding blood. But then he looked over his shoulder at Deborah. She stood under the moonlight, her silver glow fading, looking at him not with fear, but with absolute awe and love. Stanley didn't want his reign to restart with the blood of his family, no matter how treacherous. With a roar of disgust, he threw Terence across the courtyard. The beta crashed into the stone wall and slumped to the ground, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated. "Strip him of his rank," Stanley commanded, his voice booming like thunder, ensuring every wolf heard him. "Terence Boyle and Diane Pratt are banished from the Silver Crest. If they are seen in our territory again, kill them on sight." Stanley turned his golden gaze toward the crowd. It landed on Vernon Peck, who was shaking uncontrollably, clutching his broken wrist. "As for you, Vernon," Stanley growled, taking a slow, menacing step toward the rival Alpha, "you sold me a treasure thinking it was trash. You will leave my lands immediately, and if you ever speak my queen's name again, I will cross the border and burn your pack to the ground. Am I understood?" Vernon dropped to his knees, exposing his neck in absolute submission. "Yes, Alpha King, yes." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King, the man they thought was broken forever, turned his back on his enemies and walked strong, proud, and completely whole back toward the center of the courtyard. He stopped in front of Deborah. The rain had stopped. The clouds parted, allowing the bright, clear light of the full moon to wash over the fortress. Stanley looked down at Deborah. He reached out, his massive, bloodied hands gently cupping her face. He didn't care that the entire pack was watching. He didn't care about pack politics or ancient laws. All he cared about was the woman who had walked into the darkness of his room and refused to let him die. "You stood by me when I was nothing," Stanley whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You gave me back my strength. You gave me back my life. I only gave you what was already yours, Deborah murmured, leaning into his touch, her heart soaring. No, Stanley corrected, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. You gave me something better. You gave me a reason to fight. He dropped to one knee. The Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the region, knelt before the rejected Omega. A gasp rippled through the pack. Wallace York smiled widely, wrapping an arm around Tammy. Even Ulysses and Sherry, watching from the balcony, bowed their heads in reverence. Deborah Holt, Stanley's voice rang out, clear and uncompromising. You are not an Omega. You are a spirit weaver. You are my savior, my equal, and my fated mate. Will you rule this pack by my side, not as a political pawn, but as my true queen? Tears of joy spilled over Deborah's lashes. The years of abuse, the pain of rejection, the fear of her own power, it all washed away in the golden light of Stanley's eyes. Yes, she choked out, pulling him up by his collar. Yes, my Alpha, my king. Stanley didn't wait another second. He pulled her against his chest and crashed his lips onto hers. The kiss was a collision of fire and silver light, a desperate, passionate, and victorious claiming of souls. The pack erupted into a deafening chorus of howls, the sound echoing off the mountains, signaling to the world that the Silver Crest was whole once more. Months later, the fortress was unrecognizable. The gloom had been replaced by warmth and laughter. Deborah sat on the balcony of the king's chambers, the morning sun kissing her skin. She watched as Stanley sparred with Wallace in the courtyard below, moving with lightning speed and terrifying grace. He paused, looking up at the balcony. Even from that distance, she could feel the heat of his gaze. He offered her a wicked, boyish grin, a promise of the night to come. Deborah smiled, placing a hand over her stomach, where a new, faint spark of silver energy was just beginning to grow. She was an Omega who had been thrown to the wolves, but instead of letting them devour her, she had healed the king, tamed the beast, and become the most powerful queen the realm had ever known. What an incredible journey of resilience, hidden strength, and finding love where you least expect it. Deborah's story reminds us that society's labels like rejected or Omega never define our true worth. Just like Deborah, we all carry a hidden power within us, waiting for the right moment, and sometimes the right person, to help us unlock it. Even when you feel broken, like Stanley, the right kind of love and unwavering support can help you stand tall again. If you loved this dramatic tale of betrayal, healing, and absolute alpha dominance, please like this video, leave a comment telling me your favorite moment. Was it the explosive healing scene, or Stanley's epic comeback? And subscribe to the channel for more immersive cinematic stories. Remember, your scars don't make you weak, they prove you survived. Keep shining your light, and I'll see you in the next story.